Hey everybody, this is Richard and welcome to another episode of Fatal Error. This show began as a research project for me to understand how entrepreneurs and founders think about the climate emergency and figure out ways in which all organizations, not just non-profits, can become climate positive. My guest today is Astrid Scholz, entrepreneur, activist and changemaker. She is the former president of Ecotrust, co-founder and CEO of Pharah, and co-founder of Zebras Unite. What's a zebra? It's the exact opposite of a unicorn. Why does that matter? Because, as you can guess by now, company structures and objectives have an immediate and direct effect on our environment. Let's hear what she has to say. I first came across your profile in my very first interview for this podcast with Rand Fishkin, who is an entrepreneur who started a small company and was inspired very much by the stuff that you published around zebras versus unicorns, right? So he sort of tried to set up his company in that way. And I looked you up and I was super interested in all the stuff that you've done. And aside from founding, I hope I get this right, but aside from founding the Zebras Unite kind of organization, you're also the CEO of an organization called Pharah. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yep.
And past president of Ecotrust, right? So there's a lot to draw on there. So can you start us off just by telling me a little bit about what the current things you're working on are, right? So Pharah and Zebras Unite, what do they do? What's the mission of those organizations?
Yeah, and I'll actually corrupt your process right off the bat by changing the sequence. So it's actually instructive to think back to my career at Ecotrust, which is a conservation-based organization that does really innovative work here on the west coast of North America. Essentially looking for, I would characterize it now as looking for scalable business models that have sort of landscape scale impact, right? So for example, we came up with an ecological forest fund as a mechanism for converting industrially managed forests into forests that optimize for things like species diversity and carbon storage and clean water, which is not something you can do as a nonprofit, right? I mean, there are plenty of nonprofits that do forest conservation, but if you're trying to do it at a scale that matters, you have to change the underlying business model of how we manage forests.
Okay, so at the risk of completely corrupting my process there, that is super interesting, right? So maybe I don't know, maybe we can come back to it. I've made a note because this is the kind of thing that is very interesting to me, because sort of making changes to things and keeping them profitable is something which a lot of people struggle with, and it is possible. And so if there's a model, then I'd love to sort of like learn about that. But maybe carry on with the Ecotrust bit and then move on to the others, and then I'll try and sort of loop us back to that.
Yeah. No, and that's why I started there, because you have this interest in climate and the environment. The thing about Ecotrust is it's a good-sized organization, budget of about 10 million, and with all the forest land and other things, it owns, probably 150 million in assets under management. So it's a good-sized organization for an NGO, and it's too small, right? It's not going to solve the problem of climate change itself. And it is a regional organization. So this great innovation of the Forest Land Investment Fund is limited to this region. And the CEO of that organization, all she does is run around, raise capital and buy land. And she's not going to go to conferences and talk about it in Europe or China. I mean, she might have some investors there, but she's not, it's not her job. Her job is not to think about how this model could spread around the world.
Sure.
And so I'm trained as an economist. And so after 15 years in that organization, the pattern that emerged was really troubling to me, which is that organizations like Ecotrust exist the world over, and they come up with these great innovations that are then siloed. They basically get stuck in a particular region because it's not that organization's mission to go beyond. And at the same time, when you think about forestry, right, like a model that figures that out, that could work anywhere. Sure, the trees are different, right? But some of the fundamentals of this new business model, a large part could probably translate Like some percentage, maybe it's 80%, maybe it's 20%, whatever the number, it could abbreviate the innovation path for some social entrepreneur somewhere else in the world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly many other business models translate, right? So why shouldn't that?
Exactly. Why shouldn't that be the case for the social change industry? And what you see instead is everything is super siloed, and we keep reinventing the wheel. All the dysfunction of the social change space at a moment in history when we really cannot afford to be losing any time, right? Yeah. So the inefficiency of that industry drove me kind of crazy. And at the same time, with the emergence of platform technologies and social media, sort of the thought arose, well, geez, why don't we do that for innovation that actually saves the planet? So why don't we build a platform that would make it easy to discover and repurpose and adapt existing innovations to new context? And that's basically the origins of my company, Pharah, which was incubated at Ecotrust. And then I took it out, I left as president to build the company around this idea of how do we create essentially innovation liquidity, right? How do we make it easy to discover what's already working?
What's your business model there? What do you do? Do you incubate companies?
No.
Or do you provide consulting?
The business model where? I'm sorry.
For Pharah.
No, so Pharah is basically started out as an enterprise SaaS company, software as a service, right? So we built a product that allows anyone, there's a public-facing product where anyone can share solutions. And what we have done is we've broken them down in a way that makes them easier to share, like a recipe, right? As opposed to telling you a story about something that's working, back to the Ecotrust Forest Fund, I could tell you, geez, Richard, I've got this great, it's like describing a chocolate cake to you, right? Like, I could tell you how wonderful it is, and I brought it to a party, and here's the picture of all the happy people eating my cake, and it was so popular, I took an exit survey, and 75% said it was the best thing at the buffet, and meanwhile, you're saying, well, Astrid, if your cake is so great, I really want the recipe, right?
Yeah.
So we build a product around mobilizing sort of the recipe nature of existing solutions, and then we build a SaaS product around it for foundations and NGOs and multi-stakeholder initiatives.
Okay.
Basically, anytime there is a group of people that already have an interest in curating what everybody is doing.
So it's a sort of open sourcing of the processes behind
it. Yeah, exactly, right? So you create an open repository, but the product itself is an enterprise SaaS product because it replaces what otherwise would be, more often than not, as a custom-built website that, again, doesn't talk to anything.
Right.
So now on our platform, you can have your own branded solution hub, your own space, but make all your solutions also visible to everybody else, right?
Okay.
So that's the basic idea behind Pharah. And we figured out two things, one of which leads me directly to Zebras Unite, which is why I tell the story in this direction. One thing we figured out is that we're very early to market, right? Mm-hmm. So people talk about collaboration and the need for more effectively sharing what's already working. And in reality, none of our business processes are really set up around it. So at Pharah, we actually pivoted to doing a fair bit of strategic consulting and system design to help organizations and foundations and corporations understand their purpose. Like, what are you trying to do? Oh, you're trying to solve climate change. Then that's great. Why are all your processes organized around just achieving your marketing goals, right?
Okay. You do this consulting for NGOs?
For anyone.
Or anyone, okay.
Yeah, it's basically for anyone. It's NGOs, it's corporations, it's foundations, multi-stakeholder initiatives, governments, whoever wants to figure out how they can more effectively increase their positive impact, right? Like, and achieve a social or environmental purpose. And then the notion is that what we recommend to you it may or may not include our own product. So our answer always leads us in the direction of, there is probably a technology that will enable what you're trying to do. Mm-hmm. And it may be ours, it may be somebody else's, it may be a combination of things that we build.
Sure, which is a fairly standard way of doing things as well. So it's like fair enough. Okay, so then how do we get to Zebras then?
So my company makes this pivot into strategic consulting and doing product development basically cooperatively with our partners and clients. And in the meantime, I'm out there a few years ago, I thought, well, we had some traction, right? And so we thought, well, it's early, but let's see if we can raise some financing for this company. And I ran smack dab into all the usual problems of, raising capital while female. And come to find out that, sort of experience firsthand the biases that exist, the pattern matching that exists, but also, frankly, the whole VC culture is not very imaginative. Companies like mine that force you to think a little bit about, like, what is it? What? You're not doing sushi delivery by drone? I don't understand. Like, what? Collaboration? Ugh, you're selling to nonprofits. Where's the profit in that? I mean, that's the stupidity you have to deal with. So it turns out I'm building a more complex company. It's making, I should say, it's a simple company, but it's making a more complex intervention in the market. Right, that is ultimately very profitable, and it's a very large market. So it's not for lack of ambition, right? But it's a more difficult intervention to describe to investors. And at the same time, I thought, well, this is stupid. As I was beginning to have this experience, Jen Brandel and Mara Zepeda, right around the same time in 2016, had started reflecting on their experience, also as female tech founders, and wrote this wonderful piece, Sex and Startups, in 2016.
Well, yes, because and I have one of the notes that I was curious about why, I think the Twitter handle for the Zebras account is still Sex and Startups, right? And
no, we changed it. There's a legacy account. Okay. But it started out as Sex and Startups, and for all the reasons that you would suspect, right?
But was that a gender thing? Was it about sort of the gender issue there specifically, or was it like just because you wanted to grab attention? Or
yeah, well, did we want to grab attention? I mean, we did grab attention, right? Like anytime you're trying to do culture change and create a new narrative, being provocative and eye-catching has its benefits, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So that was definitely part of the appeal, and it was also just humorous. It was just funny as heck, that first piece, right? Like once you start thinking about it, liquidity events, and, seed rounds, and you're going, oh my God, how did I not see this until they wrote it down? And both of them are recovering journalists, right? So we just had a field day with it, and it was at that same fall that actually Matt and I were both living in Portland, Oregon at the time, and so we met and hit it off, and then met Ania. And it became very clear that the four of us had, shared this experience of seeing this systemic mismatch between founders and the capital that's available. We were all building these interesting companies that didn't fit the usual paradigm.
Yeah.
And the response to Sex and Startups was, well, what then is the alternative, right? And that's what prompted us to write Zebras Fix What Unicorns.
And just to be clear, so because I've read some of the background of you, but you mean the alternative to the traditional VC-funded approach to company growth, right? Which is very often this very, very big focus on very quick growth, kind of growth rates, 10, 50x.
Growth at all costs, right? And we articulated some principles, sort of, and drew some distinctions between, again, like companies like mine. It's not a lifestyle company. We're making a very serious intervention in a very large market, and if we do it right, it'll be very profitable.
Okay, so
there was no nomenclature, like there was no vernacular, right? You were either an ambitious founder and wanted to build a unicorn, or you were, you're just building a lifestyle company.
Yeah,
which we think is bullshit, right? Like we need a different narrative here.
And so, what is the new narrative that you've kind of?
Well, that's the narrative of the Zebras, right? That's the idea that there are companies that can be built for profit and for purpose, like mine, that have ambitious goals but don't grow at all costs, right? That are very thoughtful about how they treat their customers, and that have a sort of a different orientation in how they think about their role in the world, right? And that's reflected in how you treat staff. That may be reflected in what kind of structures you set up to reward people, and down the list. So that's sort of some of the distinctions. And also, interestingly, a lot of us, and this is why my personal story is relevant, we're very focused on generating revenue. Right, like I very quickly, when I had my experience in the capital markets, I just got bored with having, and it's just the grind of like having to show up a certain way because VCs can only perceive you a certain way. It's like I could spend all my time doing that, or I could be selling my product or my services and continue to build market proof, right?
Yeah.
And so we actually find that a lot of entrepreneurs are just very motivated by revenue and profitability.
So did you raise funding in the end?
Nah, we ended up, part of what made us such a bit of a complicated fit is that we started out as under a nonprofit. And so we essentially had the equivalent of seed funding through a bunch of grants, but it was a difficult story for outside finance investors to get their head around. And so we just dropped it. Yeah.
And did you raise any money for the Zebras project?
So yes. So once we had, so I'm happy to talk about that if that's of interest.
Yeah, because presumably you raised so here's where my interest would be. Presumably you raised money along, on the terms that you're describing. So not the 50x growth in 2 months kind of thing, right?
Ironic.
So,
yeah,
right, exactly. So I guess how did you find those kinds of investors, and what return are they looking for?
Yeah, and again, what we're doing with Zebras is interesting because, we wrote Zebras Fix What Unicorns Break, and we're completely blown away by how many people it resonated with, right? So thousands of people, thousands and thousands of people from all over the world.
I'm not surprised. I mean, honestly, I'm really not surprised. The moment I heard it, I immediately was like, oh yeah. I mean, even the sort of the unicorn narrative never sat well with so many of my colleagues. And
I mean, so in a way, we gave voice to something that a lot of people were experiencing, right?
Yeah.
And so the interest was just phenomenal and continues to be phenomenal. And so we knew, oh shoot, it looks like we're going to have to build something here. And the first thing we did was to say, well, what does everybody want? What do you need, right? And so we hosted a gathering here in Portland in the fall of 2017, and just basically got set up with a nonprofit fiscal sponsor, so we could attract grant funding and sponsorships. And that was okay for the first couple of years of our existence, right? So we basically functioned as a nonprofit. And then last year, with the grant funding we had, we undertook a strategic planning process and began to sort of reorganize ourselves into what is now a for-profit, multi-stakeholder cooperative that we just launched not that long ago, actually. So the nonprofit retains a share in the co-op, but then all of us become owners of the co-op, right? There's 6,000 people in the online community. It'd be great if all 6,000 of them converted into co-op members. Sure. But the idea basically is that, look, we as entrepreneurs who are building these innovative companies, or as investors who want to invest in those kinds of companies, let's just own the mechanism by which we create the capital and community and culture that all of us need to thrive, right? And then we distribute any profits to the membership. Yes. And so now you actually get rewarded for building the company and building the movement, as opposed to.
And it's not such a new idea in some ways, not to minimize what you've done, but cooperatives have been around for a very, very long time, even before they were formalized, perhaps.
Well, exactly, right? It's a very old form to recognize shared contributions and create and value creation.
Yet most investors will just sort of dismiss you if you go raise money for a cooperative, right?
And
that's institutional investors. So what kind of investors did you find?
None yet.
Okay.
No, we're just stepping out. So look, our focus is on actually the membership itself. Okay. I would rather have 6,000 people who each buy $100 share, right, and raise some operating funds that way than trying to chase 2 or 3 investors who put in 200,000 each. That said, I mean, we are interested and are talking to some interested investors, and what motivates them is that they're really curious about the whole sort of pivoting to ownership that we describe in our latest piece, right? Like the idea in Pivot to People that we can play defensive in how we rethink our companies, what we do to large tech companies that are undermining our democracy as we speak, at least here in the US. Or we can play offense.
You don't have a monopoly on that.
Well, right.
It's
Or we can be off, or we can play offense and say we just need to build better companies,
yeah.
and they have these requirements, and that requires a different kind of support infrastructure.
Okay, so let me join the dot a little bit with the environmental side of things, right? So first of all, I guess, you know, the focus of this project is really, you know, stems from the climate emergency that we're experiencing or about to experience. So my first question would simply be like, what's your position on that? You know, you've got one extreme, you've got people who just don't believe it's an issue. On the other extreme, you have people who are super worried.
Well, no,
You
that's
know,
why I created my company, right? Like my company Sphere exists so we can accelerate the pace of change to, you know, towards solving the climate emergency and all the other big global problems that are captured in the Sustainable Development Goals.
okay, so I'm not gonna, you know, what's the term? Preaching to the choir kind of thing. So we're on the same music sheet there. So how does you know, maybe a practical example or just an ideological thing that maybe you can describe. You said before, zebras fix what unicorns break, right? So in the context of climate, right? And of course, climate is a very broad term, but it's food production, pollution, bunch of things that kind of, but how does how do you envisage these kind of companies? What
Yeah, I
make,
can.
you know, what is it that gets them to fix what the unicorns are breaking, right? And how, what's the sort of DNA, I suppose, of the company? What is it that makes it a solution rather than just another mechanism for making money?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a really good
Which would
question.
be fine. Like, that's fine. Having a mechanism for making money is not a bad thing. But how are they fixing what somebody else is breaking?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm trying to find a climate specific example, but well, take for example, well, one thing that all of us have been experiencing, right, in this pandemic is food delivery, right,
Mm-hmm.
and food delivery services. And so you can build these services in a way that, you know, uses huge trucking fleets that perhaps, you know, have a massive environmental footprint. You can do it in ways that is extractive in terms of, you know, like a Grub hub, like taking 30%, you know, on every transaction, and neither the restaurant owner nor the customer ultimately benefits. There are sort of or there are new sort of produce companies, right, that are like whatever imperfect produce that still, you know, that on the one hand lead with the sort of environmental veneer, but they're actually not making a difference at the farm in
Mm-hmm.
terms of the money that the farmer takes home. And then contrast that, for example, with a business that's active here in Portland and Seattle called Local Milk Run. And it
Mm-hmm.
is just what it sounds. I mean, you're in Scotland, right? So you remember the milkman, right? Who would bring your milk up to in a little. You probably still have one.
Well, we have a friend who actually just dropped off some milk like half an hour ago.
Well, there you go,
It's the
right? So
third
that
time I've mentioned him on the podcast. I should give him a proper credit. It's just but
you,
yes, I
right.
know. Yes.
So now imagine a business that does that, but not just for milk, but actually for a whole basket of products and produce that are created within 50 to 100 miles of my town.
Okay.
Right. So now I can subscribe to a produce box that shows up on my porch every week or every 2 weeks. And it's got the local bread and the local cheese and the local salami and the locally roasted coffee, yada, yada, right?
Yeah.
And so now what you're doing is you are actually making an intervention in the food system, right? You're shortening the distance that your food travels. You are supporting local farmers, right, who more often than not are using organic practices, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so now you've reduced the environmental footprint, right? And so that's a company that is not. I mean, they're doing very well in the pandemic, but they have to be very thoughtful about how they scale, right? Because it really requires them to know the sort of the food shed around a city, right? So they're not going to willy-nilly just blitzscale and try to be everywhere at the same time, because they have to understand their supply of this in this ecosystem before they can offer their services. So it's very different from, oh, I'm going to be whatever, imperfect produce.
Okay, so we have those two examples. Let's say you have this sort of company that's very thoughtful around where they're sourcing the ingredients from, how they're getting them delivered, maybe how they're packaged, and so on, and making sure
how they compensate the farmers, right? So they
how the revenue is shared with the producers, and so on and so forth. And then you've got somebody else, like you mentioned, I can't remember whether you mentioned a name in particular, but say one of the larger brands. I mean, over here we have the big supermarkets as well, who sort of, they're kind of undercutting prices and so on and so forth. When you're the zebra, right, and you're up against this big thing, right, who is, at all costs wants to win and has the kind of financial leverage to do so, or to do certain things, how do you win? Or at least how do you survive, right? Are you just appealing to people's better nature? Because that might work with some people, but not necessarily proven to be the best way of winning in a market. So
yeah, I think that sort of way of thinking of winning a market, it's a typical sort of zero-sum game mentality of most of capitalism as we know it.
I don't mean, just to clarify, by winning I don't mean that you sort of like you win and everybody else dies kind of thing, right? By everybody else I mean the companies. But so that you're succeeding in whatever the goal was. You're growing, right? You're growing your revenues, you have a healthy growth rate, and you're sort of not living from hand to mouth as a business, right?
Yeah. So again, I mean, for example, how you treat your customer, right, will make a difference. So if you're a venture funded company that's blitzscaling, your sales apparatus is predicated on churn, right? Like you expect to turn over your paying users a lot. And if you're a zebra, maybe you have a smaller user base, but they're more loyal because you actually treat them like a community, right? And so it shows up very differently in the experience that people have in your product and in your service, and ultimately that's a differentiator, right? So for example, I mean, you and I are on a platform right now that's obviously grown like crazy during the pandemic, right? Yeah. And people also have real heartburn about it, right? Because there are real questions about how safe these communications are, whether or not information gets shared with foreign governments, all this stuff. And the company Zoom doesn't have any good answers for that, really, that engender trust in people. And then you have other services like a Zebra company called Crowdcast that has also grown phenomenally during the pandemic. It's a live streaming platform who are very transparent about their values. They take great care of their customers. They provide a great experience for their users. They're responsive and so on. And so, I mean, ultimately, the end user still has a choice on, like, if you're thinking about running a conference, which product you're going to use. But I believe that, and we see this borne out in the performance of Zebra companies, how you show up in the market becomes a differentiator.
Okay.
For your benefit. To your benefit. Yeah.
I think people discount that still. There's such a lot of talk about it becomes subsumed a little bit into the branding conversation over the last sort of few decades. But I guess sort of establishing a really personal relationship, even at scale, is possible and can be a differentiator.
Well, or take the example of some platforms that turn themselves into cooperatives, right? So where
give me an example.
So Savvy Co-op is a patient cooperative that basically monetizes information about rare diseases and helps patients participate in research, and the patients benefit, right? So you are actually an owner of the company that engages with the pharmaceutical and sort of the whole industrial research complex. And you could do the same with a platform like Uber, right? But Uber is extractive, and I mean these are different markets, obviously, but there are
Well, it's a different market, but the principle is the same, right?
principle is the same, right? Like one you make your user part of your owner, and in the others you just extracting from the user the different types of users, and you're actually playing them off against each other, right? When you think about how many of the algorithms in platforms like Uber are optimized to basically play out the rider against the driver.
So I'm interested to ask you this question as well, because you have quite a lot of experience with both for-profit and non-profit organizations, right? And one of the things that struck me in recent conversations I've been having is a lot of people seem to have a distinction of like, well, non-profits and charities do good. Like by definition, if you're non-profit, you must be for good, right? For a good purpose, which is not necessarily true, but that's kind of the impression, right? And so everybody else is absolved of doing good, kind of, by just donating some money. Everybody else, other organizations, other companies. And like, if you're a for-profit company, then you're not necessarily for good, right? And I think I've spoken to some entrepreneurs, and I've myself struggled with the idea of like, well, do you need to justify making money out of doing a good thing? Like, where, at what point, you know, do you say, well, it's not exploitative, I'm just making a living out of this? But then if you're, you know, if you suddenly grown and you're employing people, then, well, are you making too much money out of doing good? Are you exploitative as a firm at that point?
I mean, people can be really deliberate about how they create their organizational culture, right? Like nobody forces you to pay yourself 500 times as a CEO what your lowest paid employee makes, right? You can reject that kind of greed in your organizational structure and in your corporate culture. And we see that, right? Like we see companies that are built very, very thoughtfully around how employees participate in you know, through whether it's through stock ownership or through direct ownership of a company, for example. So I think there are ways to do that that are not extractive, but I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a function of being a nonprofit or being a for-profit, right? I mean, look, the National Rifle Association, the NRA, is a nonprofit in the U.S. It's not doesn't do good, and its CEO just got busted by the New York district attorney, right? The Manhattan district attorney for essentially enriching himself. So, you know, you can be abusive in a nonprofit as well. Like, or look at some of the charges that are leveled against the Boy Scouts, for example. So
yes, I've read some of these things.
I think it's just
those are sort of extreme. They're kind of extreme examples in a sense of, you know, that doesn't happen very often, at least that we know of. Whereas I think most of for many companies, right, who are, you know, they're not doing anything bad, but they're not doing anything good in the sense of like social good, right? And that's maybe just by perception, right? Like the idea of like, well, the way we are good is by making a charitable donation, right, to a non-profit, right? And there's this sort of thing which kind of keeps cropping up when talking about climate and sustainability and so on, where it's like, well, if we're going to put money into carbon offsets, for example, or renewable or better energy sources, well, why should I pay that energy company? They're just making money just like the other energy company. Or well, I don't want to pay my offset to an organization that's making money off planting the forests, for example, right? And so you sort of get this weird feeling in some people, which I don't necessarily agree with, right? It's not that just because you're for profit then you're not doing a good thing.
Yeah, and again, it's like, what do you do with the profit, right? So we're organized as a cooperative, and the decision about what happens with the profit is made democratically, right? So anyone can actually become a member of Zebras Unite, and then you're effectively participating in the governance decisions, which is different from most companies that are C corps or whatever they are, right, where all the goodness, all the financial upside only gets shared with investors.
It's just exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, to wrap up, I'd love to loop back to that original thing that you mentioned about the forestry. So I'd sort of love to hear the backstory and sort of what happened, but the sort of the idea of taking a piece of land, the larger sort of like the better from a conservation environmental perspective, that is being used in a suboptimal way, right, from an environmental point of view, and turning that into something different, but which is still profitable. Sounds like, kind of a holy grail of these kinds of of people who are interested in this stuff, right? So what happened there? What's the backstory? I'd love to sort of close on that if you can share that story.
Yeah, I mean, the backstory is that there's a lot of very little old growth remaining in this part of the world, but there is a coastal temperate rainforest here on the west coast of North America, roughly from Northern California all the way through Alaska, through British Columbia, and a lot of that forest land is managed for sort of pulp and paper production, lots of plantation, lots of second growth. And the basic insight of ecological forestry is to say, well, what if we got away from the monocultures, reestablish species diversity, and let the forests do what forests do best, right?
Yeah.
Which is store carbon, create clean water, create habitat for everything from salmon to endangered, marbled murrelets. And then you figure out how to it turns out, right, like with carbon markets, for example, or with biodiversity offsets, with markets for non-timber forest products, and with high value markets for more furniture grade timber, you can actually make these different models pencil out. And there's a little bit of, obviously there's a lot of skill to it, like transitioning an industrial forest to an ecological forest takes time, right? So it takes an upfront investment to do some of the restoration work, but then it takes off and it starts cranking out all these ecosystem services essentially that you can monetize.
And how much of an investment, are we talking about here? Like what sort of?
Well, like
but both the things. So like not just the quantity, but how much time as well, right? So is it like?
No, I mean, forests are obviously, those are very, very much fixed assets, right? Like those are, think real estate, right? Decades. The landscape, I mean, it's a multi-billion-dollar opportunity to basically flip the landscape from industrial forestry to ecological forestry. And this particular company now is on its, I think they're raising their third or fourth fund. So it's the usual progression, right? You raise a small fund, then you raise a larger fund. I think this last fund is like maybe 75 to 100 million-ish. Okay. I haven't talked to the CEO in a bit.
Do you know the name of the company? Do you remember it?
Yeah, it's Ecotrust Forest Management or Forest Investment, EFM Investment.
Oh, okay. It's part of the, okay, got it. It's part of Ecotrust.
Yes, it's part of the Ecotrust innovation, basically.
Okay, understood. Great. Okay, well, listen, that's been a really good sort of conversation for me. I don't want to keep you too long because we'll try and keep it to the kind of allotted time, but just one sort of super final thing, like if somebody wanted to participate, kind of, get something out of the Zebras project, Zebras Unite, what can people go and do on the site? Where is a good place to start?
The website is a great place to start. It's at zebrasunite.com. It'll redirect to zebrasunite.coop, and you can learn more about the community, about the work we're doing around the culture change, and about our investment activities as well at Zebras Unite Capital.
Brilliant. Okay, well, Astrid, thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Best of luck with all the different projects, and we'll hope to chat soon. Thank you for listening. Please visit fataleria.blog to join our mailing list and help support our community and project. And if you like the music, please check out the Happy Quartet on Bandcamp. That's it for today.